here we have Councillor Jenny Fradgley and Peter Keynton-Hook, my brother, and they're going to have a chat about the Stratford-upon-Avon Development Plan.
Yes, well, we're going to look at a particular section of it.
Okay.
Because, yesterday, Mayor John Bicknell was in and Chris interviewed him and he sort of gave an overview.
Okay.
But talking with Jenny today, we're going to look specifically at the housing section of it, which I think is an important one for people that people would want to know about.
Absolutely, yes.
Can I just say, actually, this is the Stratford-upon-Avon Neighbourhood Development Plan.
I left the neighbourhood bits
really
out.
Important
Yes.
that it's a community-led document that actually should help the town.
Right.
So when you were devising this, was that as a title, was that something that was really thought through and with the message it conveys?
Well, the Neighbourhood Development Plan really comes down from the government. When I was mayor in 2009-10, it's when the government was first mooting the idea that local communities could actually have some impact, some input into the plans which were being developed, the core strategies and the national plans. And they actually said that there was an element that local people could actually have an input.
So this started as long ago as that?
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, it was the last year, 2010 really, that I thought it might be a good idea as mayor, so I was looking into it with the town clerk. And at the end of my mayoral year, we'd actually put out invitations and information to anybody in the town who'd like to come along for an inaugural meeting to see if there was an appetite to do something about this. And that very first meeting, there were about 45, 50 people turned up. And that's where it kind of started. And they did feel that it was a good idea to meet up to see what issues the town would like to highlight to improve it and protect it going forward. Yeah.
Because I think this was the first time the government was going to get people in, local people
to get
to
local
involve.
people in.
Yes.
I mean, it was quite a surprise. Yeah, it was great that local people were being asked to come forward. Yeah.
So how did it develop from there? Because people might say, well, that's quite a long time. But I'm guessing if you're going right in a foundation and you're talking with local people, how did you go about that? What sort of things did you do?
Well, that very, very big meeting then decided that it would become a steering group. And the steering group met and the town councillors decided that really they shouldn't take part. They shouldn't take a leading part, only an advisory part as and when was necessary, because this should be led completely by the community, which it was. And this large group of people coalesced around ideas. They went down byways and highways and all sort of over the place. And eventually, after about 6 months, 4 people came out as kind of leaders of it and formed the driving group. And then the steering group came along to advise, listen to and monitor how their ideas were being taken forward.
And did you reach out to a bigger population?
Yes, there was the very first thing they did was to send out, I think it was something like 25,000 what they call mood cards, postcards. And people were asked what they liked about Stratford, what they didn't like, what they'd like to change, and whether they'd like to be involved in some way. And I think they got about 2,000 odd replies, emails and replies from that. So then that became another group that was kept informed of what was going on.
So when, obviously that's a group at the foundation, but there must be lots of other groups, organisations, levels of local government that are involved.
Oh, very much so, because the Neighbourhood Development Plan has to be an accepted policy document for policies for developing the town. And so out of all the good ideas and fantastic ideas that came forward, they had to coalesce, they had to be organised, they had to be pulled into a planning document, and eventually that was actually pulled together by these 4 people who came forward, plus the planning officer at the town council, who wrote it up in planning speak. And so by 2015, the document was more or less complete. And then it went out for various consultations. There were consultations at the town hall. It went out to developers. It went out to residents' associations. And lots of ideas then came back, had to be rewritten. And eventually it went to the district council towards the end of 2015 in its finished form for more consultations, more looking at, more deciding whether it's actually fitted with the core strategy and the national planning policies. And it was finally released for referendum about a month ago. So that's why we've got the referendum coming up on
The 29th.
Thursday, the 29th of
Yes.
November. And but it hasn't been very long since it has been released saying, yeah, it's ready for referendum. So it's been quite a tight time to get people to know about it and understand what it's all about.
Yeah. So I'm getting, listening to what you're talking about. The language has got to be very clear, which must involve the law, and that must come in at different levels of that.
It has to be precisely written in planners' language, otherwise it won't carry the weight that it needs to when it becomes a document, hopefully, which is approved on the 29th. It wouldn't become a document that could be used for planning, to make planning decisions and resist planning or promote planning as the community would like.
So there's input not just from the local people in the town council, but this is also the district council, the county council.
Well, the neighbourhood plan has to agree in general terms and principle with the core strategy. The core strategy is a document that sets out the planning rules for the whole of the district. And the core strategy has to conform and agree with the NPPF, the National Policy Planning Framework, which is a document set out by the government. So there are these three key planning documents.
So could you tell me then, what do you feel are some of the most important points of having the neighbourhood development plan in place? What advantages is it going to provide
Well,
Stratford as an area,
sorry, I've got a bit
all
of a
the
cough.
people of Stratford?
It's incredibly important because if you actually go onto the website, and I hope we'll give you that website detailed in a moment, and you look at it, you'll see from the map that Stratford has a built-up area which defines the area of the built-up area of Stratford in black. Alveston, which is a service village, has got a defined built-up area in red, and Alveston is Tiddington and Alveston are service villages, and they're defined in red. The neighbourhood plan, you'll notice, is defined in red, but it's a very, very much bigger area than the built-up areas, and that is key to one of the major, one of the most important strategies, which is policy H1. And that is built-up area boundaries. And that, if I could read it to you, would that be
Yes,
okay?
no, please do. Yes.
Proposals for new housing within these built-up area boundaries will be supported in principle. So that means within the built-up areas, any development in principle will be supported because that's a built-up area. All areas outside the built-up area boundaries are classed as countryside. That's the area between the black line and the red line of the neighbourhood plan. New housing within the countryside will be strictly controlled and limited to dwellings for rural workers, rural exception sites, replacement dwellings, conversion of buildings of a permanent construction, and construction of houses with exceptional design and appropriate development of brownfield sites beyond the built-up area. So that is quite a powerful policy. If anybody comes forward over the planned period, that's 2011 to 2031, this actually applies within that planned period. This gives protection to that land between the built-up areas and the neighbourhood plan.
So this is one of the most important parts of it, is that there are these planning restrictions
They
rules
helped
instead
to
put in?
resist and guide
Mhm.
planning, yes.
Mm.
But most of the houses designated for Stratford or agreed for Stratford from the government through the district and down to the town, they've already been agreed. And if you look at the map in the development plan, you'll see where those houses have been agreed and where those development sites are. So I think it's 3,500 have been agreed, and you can see those sites. A site within the town centre, which is the Canal Quarter, which was designated as a brownfield site, and a great desire that we should actually bring more intensive development inside the town boundary for various sustainable reasons. That is still under consideration at the moment, and if you will be able to find the ideas which are coming forward to develop that site. So that site is in development and might actually take a few more houses, but then that's within the agreed sort of proposition of houses.
And where did the 3,500 number come from?
That's quite an interesting story because as a core strategy was coming into place a few years ago, we didn't have a core strategy, and that's where a number of developments along the Birmingham Road came from, because developers were coming in, putting in applications for developing greenfield sites on the outside of the town, and because there wasn't a core strategy and there wasn't a 5-year land supply, which I'll explain in a moment, developers really almost had carte blanche because they would get permission. Even if local councillors refused it, as they often did at the district, it could go straight to appeal, and because there wasn't a core strategy, there weren't the planning rules in place, planning policies in place, they would actually get permission from the government to build. So once the core strategy was in place with its policies, well, there was a bit of a caveat there, because the core strategy took a little bit of time to come together, because there was a desire to reduce the numbers of or restrict the number of houses that Stratford was going to have. But the government actually said on one occasion, sorry, the core strategy doesn't work, you've got to put more houses in there. And that's where those extra houses came from. And it took a little bit longer to get the core strategy into place.
Mm.
So it's really important that we have these policies which we can use.
So the policies which are within the Neighbourhood Development Plan actually bring a degree of control to the local people of Stratford as to what can happen.
They put they put extra policies in for the town itself on top of what is already in the core strategy. Core strategy is for the whole of the district, but lots of villages and hamlets and towns are now bringing forward their local development plans in order to put that detail into the core strategy to make sure that the detail of what local people want is actually respected.
Mm-hmm. And is it just a thing, a restriction, not a restriction, is there a sort of limit on the numbers, or are there other things such as environmental issues and so on which dictate?
The numbers are a minimum, not a maximum.
Right.
Planning is always very, very fluid, and that's why you need policies, so that as things change, you've got some arguments to be had to try and resist inappropriate development. It's always inappropriate development. But the neighbourhood plan actually goes into other areas as well. It looks at greenfield sites, it looks at design developments, it looks at parking, it looks at other issues as well, according to to help the development of houses be more acceptable.
So I can remember when I first moved to Stratford and so on, and there was also talk about the building in Shottery. Is it referred to as the Shottery 800, or so that so in a sense, if the plan had been in action at that time, would there have been the same sort of controversies that went ahead, or would there have been a more set?
That was quite a long time ago. That was in it actually was being argued 2006, 7, 8. It was sort of in the planning process at that point. Huge resistance to it, massive resistance to it. And in fact, it was refused. But there was a complication there because it was actually being built on land that had been put into reserve some years before. Once land goes into reserve, there is a likelihood that it's going to come forward for development, which this land did. Huge resistance to it. It was refused at town, it was refused at district. It went to appeal, and at appeal it was taken up by the Secretary of State, Mr. Pickles at the time, who looked at it and actually decided that it should go ahead. So he gave permission for it to go ahead. Having given permission for it to go ahead, the Relief Road and the Island and the Spur Road, which was all part of that, was all decided at that time. So that was kind of set in stone. Where the Neighbourhood Development Plan can come into play is how that development will be in detail, house design, how the parking works, open spaces, so it can actually tweak and influence.
So is this another important area of the policies within the plan, about the detail?
Yeah.
Could you maybe explain what do we mean by detail?
Whenever a plan comes forward, a developer might want to build 5 houses, 10 houses, 500 houses, and they will take their ideas to the district planners, because that's the body that actually makes the decision, and they'll discuss it. And at that level, they'll decide how many houses are going to go onto this site, where the access roads will be, how much open land there'll be. They'll actually decide in broad terms, and that's called outline planning permission. And that comes through the planning process. And the outline planning application, once it's been decided, will come to the Town Council, which is a consultative committee, and they will have their say on it, using the neighbourhood plan and the core strategy to make their points. If they approve or disapprove, it then goes to the district, which is the decision making. It'll be argued out at that point. If it's refused at that point, it will go to appeal. The developers will take it to appeal. If you've got good planning reasons to resist, you might win that one, you might not. If it's approved, either by the district or by appeal, it then has outline planning permission and it can be built on. But what will be built there then goes into what's called reserved matters. So the detail is worked out. Where the houses will go, whether there be terraces, whether there be blocks of flats, whether there'll be where the play areas will go, all where the landscaping will go, whether there be serial parking or whether there'll be tandem parking. All that detail is put together at the reserved matters stage. And it goes back through the planning committee, and it goes to the town consultative, and then it goes to the district. And then, if it gets permission at that stage, it'll be built. Now, what's quite interesting is, if it gets to that stage and the town has actually got issues about it, they think the design isn't quite right, or they want to talk about the parking, or they don't think there's enough green space, that can be argued out at in front of the decision making at the district. If the district decide that it's not quite right and they refuse it, the developers can go straight to appeal, but they're probably wiser to say at that stage, let's have some meetings, let's actually talk to the residents, let's talk to the councillors, let's talk to the planners, let's discuss their problems, and let's see if we can make this development more in line with what's needed. And that's where the neighbourhood plan with its policies becomes quite valuable, because you can start to influence and bring more forward what the residents have actually said in the development plan they would like to see.
So I'm guessing this is part of the time period that is taken, because the team involved have all been thinking about these things and what needs to be put in and considered and thought, and almost thinking ahead of...
Yes, I mean, it's quite often developers lose find it very, very expensive to go through the planning process. There are time limits on it, but sometimes those time limits can actually slip, and that costs a lot of money. So if the residents know of a development, get in touch with their local councillors and activate them to get the residents' associations talking with the planners, so these conversations can take place guided by the neighbourhood plan before it even gets into the planning process. You can then actually make sure the planning process is as short and as painless as possible for everyone. It doesn't always work, but where it does work, you do get better developments.
So this will help the local people of Stratford in a sense. Listening to you, you clearly have a picture, an understanding of all these different layers and how things interact. For those of us who don't have that experience, it would be very daunting.
Yeah.
But the Neighbourhood Development Plan gives us something to work from.
Very much. It gives a residents aspirations for how the town can develop more holistically and in line with what they would like to see the town develop. But we are in an age where we are being obliged to do considerable development. Luckily, we've got the number of houses in Stratford designated at the moment, and we're hoping to actually work with those houses up to 2031.
So in a sense, you've reached the minimum target.
We've reached the minimum target.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because I'm sure one of the things that people have is a fear of, what's next? But
yes.
As far as the plan is set
but
down.
What's next is the next iteration of a neighbourhood development plan called strategy, and that will be a time period 2031 to 2051. And that will start to be worked on probably 10 years or so before, probably round about the early 20s, people start to think about how the next development period will be organised. And that's so important that actually builds out of the aspirations of the neighbourhood plan. So you've got a little bit more control about how the town develops into the next development period.
And in a sense, it is literally something to build on, because you've done, in a sense, the hard work, because before this there was nothing.
Yes.
And now you've got something to move on.
Now you've got something to move on from, yeah.
Talking to Jenny Fradgley about the Neighbourhood Development Plan referendum that is coming up, specifically about housing. And you just mentioned there that you have, the planning that has gone in has reaching the minimum target. I'm sure one of the things that a lot of people are thinking about is about what type of housing and about affordable housing, and what about housing for the elderly, so on. How does that move forward? So,
yes, I mean, in the core strategy which we've spoken about, there is an expectation that development will have 35% of the homes built will be affordable as such. And that's part of the S106 planning obligations that operate at the moment, where a developer actually puts something back for the development that they can do to actually make it more acceptable and make it work for the town. And of those 35% which are affordable, the neighbourhood plan, after doing a local survey, says that we should have at least 20% of that 35% should be one bed, 40% should be two bed, no more than 35% should be three bed, and no more than 5% should be four bed, because the survey discovered within the town that there is a need for smaller houses for people to downsize to and to make them more affordable in a very expensive housing area for young people to be able to start off. Now that is different from what the core strategy comes up with. So here there's a case where it's quite specific to the town, that these are the needs of the town. And that gives the planners, it gives the councillors and the planners the ability to say to developers, if you want to build in this town, these are the percentages that we would like you to meet. It's always a discussion, but it gives a little bit more sort of power to get what the town needs. And also on market housing, the neighbourhood plan has slightly different percentages on market housing as well. And in market housing, we're asking the developers to build 10% one bedroom, which they're quite reluctant to do, but it's that's what we hope to achieve. 35% two bed, 40% three bed, 15% four bed and plus. So there is policies in the neighbourhood development plan to try and actually build the housing that we have seen the town actually wants and needs.
So this again come back to negotiations with the developers.
It's always a negotiation. Yes. Now within the 35% as well, we're looking for 20% of those houses to be affordable rents, which is 80% of market rent, and 60% social rent, which is a slightly lower rent, and some to be shared ownership. So within the tenure of the houses, it's hoped that we can actually guide to have more rented properties, which at the moment a lot of people are actually are asking for.
So it's looking to meet.
Alongside that as well, in the design, there is a requirement or an aspiration that social housing will not look different from market housing. So they should be pepper potted. The design should be the same. We shouldn't be able to see that this area is social housing and this area is market housing. So there is a lot of work is done to try and make sure that the developments we do support everybody living in that area to feel as if they belong and that they have a sort of stake in the town.
So it's looking to meet the needs of people in all sorts of circumstances.
Yeah.
And going back to the detail, I mean, I just it's only a small bit I wanted to point out was, you said it within the policy it even goes down to things like looking at the verges.
Yes, within the, I've forgotten where it is, but within the neighbourhood plan there's a section that talks about green spaces. That came out of the steering group, that they're very, very keen to give some protection to the green spaces in the town, because there are quite a lot of green spaces in Stratford, but they're sort of slightly disconnected and they're here, there and everywhere. And I must say, Friends of the Earth were one of the consultees on this, and they were very, very keen to make sure that there were green spaces that would have some connectivity to allow animals, insects to actually move around the town. So the plea went out to residents and to local ward councillors to name all the green spaces in their wards that they felt were of some significance. So when you go up St Mary's Road by the pillars there are some sort of bits of green spaces there, verges and small areas. Those have been named, so that if anybody wanted to put a car park there or whatever, there is a policy here that says no, that should remain as a green space. And if you go onto the website and you look at the green space map, you'll see where they all sit, and hopefully, if we have the opportunity, we can actually add to those green spaces to make sure that that connectivity is actually protected and developed.
And if people feel, having looked at if the referendum, if it's passed, and people are aware of potential plans and so on, what should they do if they want to have their voice heard? How can they go about? Would it be going to their ward councillor?
Get in touch with your ward councillor. You've got 2 town councillors and you've got 1 district councillor, and you do have a county councillor that sits in across 4 or 5 wards. So you've got a number of councillors there. Now they've got the key to make sure that they can get you to the table where to meet with the developers, to meet with the planners, and to make sure that your views are heard. Might not get acted on, but your views can be heard. At least you feel as if you've had a say. And the other thing is that, as we've said before, the plans actually go through a process of town consultative, district decision-making, planning committees. Your town and district councillors should be able to give you the information where you can sign up to have your 3-minute speech at those meetings, so you can actually go to the planning meetings and you can tell the councillors there what you think, whether you support or object. So that really is that's quite important. And you also stimulate your councillor to work for you if you do have an issue. There might be an extension next door to you which you think is actually taking your light. It might be 3 or 4 houses going onto somebody's garden. It might be 500 houses on a greenfield site. If you've got concerns about that, make sure you let your councillor know, because they're there to respond to their residents.
So listening to that point, you can begin to understand the importance of the referendum and for voting for this, because again, going back to that point of not having that expertise, where do I go from here? Is it going to be a frightening process to go through? The Neighbourhood Development Plan is giving you something to work from.
Yes. And actually, in your area, you might actually have a very active residents group. I know in Tiddington there's a very active residents group. There are active residents groups across the town. So if you do want to know more about what's going on in your area and you're unsure, try and get in touch with your local residents group and actually go along to their meetings, and you'll actually find about all that's going on, and you'll be able to actually participate at a very early stage in the planning process, and then have a bit more influence, hopefully.
So what might happen? I'm guessing on the ballot paper, this is yes, I'm for it, no, I'm against it.
Simple yes and no.
What would happen? Yes, ma'am. So if it's that simple, what might happen if it wasn't passed?
If it wasn't passed, we lose all the tools and all the policies that we've got here to help guide and shape where the town is going, to help resist unwanted development. You can never say absolute no to development, but if you've got these policies, you've got more power to resist and to frame and to control. The other thing is, if the neighbourhood plan is approved, it becomes a document with weight, as they say, so it has to be consulted on in the planning process. It also means that going forward, the S106 that we've talked about, which is the planning gain, which developers have to pay, is changing, and it's becoming what's called the Community Infrastructure Levy, CIL. That is applied, the district have decided how much CIL a developer will have to pay per unit built. That's quite complicated. You go onto the website and you can look at it. I won't explain it now. But CIL money then has to be paid into a pot. And if the referendum has been approved, the town has control over 25% of the CIL money of developments within the neighbourhood plan area. And it has complete control over how that money can be spent. So it could spend it on redoing the pavements, supporting a bus service, building a community hall. It then can actually respond with projects that people have actually said they want. Now that project list is in the neighbourhood plan. There is a project list in the neighbourhood plan, but that's not a definitive list. That can change as people actually come up with new and fresh ideas.
Thank you. So is there anything you'd like to ask us into that, Penny?
I mean, there's all kinds of things there, but I think one of the main things is if we don't vote yes to it, that is a huge risk.
I think it's a risk.
Because it means that people outside our area will then be able to dictate.
We'll have more control over how development happens.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So, although I know a lot of people seem to think, oh, well, it's, does my vote count? But it does count, doesn't it?
I think it does count, actually, that you're actually saying you want more control over what happens in your town. You can't dictate what happens in your town. That's not possible.
No.
But this gives the tools for control. And some of these tools are quite powerful.
Yeah.
And that's lack of understanding, especially on my part, is knowing how powerful or not some of these tools are.
Yeah.
And it's about getting interested in what's going on in your neighbourhood, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we have actually said this before, Stratford-upon-Avon Neighbourhood Development Plan. In a way, this is Stratford-upon-Avon Neighbourhood Control of Development Plan. So it puts some controls in. We can't actually say how many houses we want. That comes from a higher authority, but it does give us some control over where they go and how they look, among lots of other things in here which we haven't touched on today.
So there is more.
There is more, always more, always more.
So today, thank you for coming. I must say, this must have been a very interesting exercise to take part in. Because, we know that it's a non-political, it's all parties, everybody's been involved. So there must have been a lot of discussion, but also a lot of cooperation and coming together to understand.
This was very much from the community, as I said right at the beginning. It's that steering group of 50. It was a moving group, actually, as people came in and out of it, as they heard about it. That steering group actually gathered and lost people as it went along. So lots of people had an opportunity. But this is very much driven by the community, for the community. The local politicians stood back because they said this is a community document. It's taken up now by the local town councillors because it's our job to actually get out there and explain to people what it's about and answer questions and be held responsible for a document that we would like to have in our armoury.
Can I say thank you very much for coming in and explain to us particularly about the housing part of the strategy.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of food for thought there. Community radio in the heart of Shakespeare country, for the community, by the community, in the community.
Nice.